Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, first of all, to IWEA for your invitation to me to come and share some thoughts with you. I'll try not to be too political. I'll try not to be too critical of the government, but I think it's difficult not to highlight at least some of the failures that I think we all recognise have been in place for some time. A failure, sadly, perhaps led by government, but of society generally, to recognise the huge challenges that climate change is providing to us. But within those challenges, there are opportunities. And people like yourself and others have been at the forefront in recognising the opportunities that exist from the challenges and the potential for significant economic growth and growth potential in areas that wouldn't have been perceived before. And for that reason, I think we have to do more to identify, as I've said, the positive changes that can come about as a result of climate change, rather than just looking at it as a negative and a burden and something which must be railed against. From my point of view, our party sees the need for a radically improved approach to renewables as a fundamental pillar of Ireland's response to climate change. We recognise the huge moral obligation that we bear to take immediate action to tackle global warming. Increasing the share of renewable energy, particularly wind, in my view, is fundamental to reducing Ireland's polluting emissions. On the positive side, the EPA and the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland have recently shown that wind is providing more than a quarter of Ireland's electricity demand, greatly reducing the carbon intensity of the electricity system. I also note that your significant analysis last year highlighted wind energy's downwards pressure on price at a very low cost to the Irish consumer. You have also rightly indicated the significant employment potential of the wind energy sector, particularly for rural areas. And as we've all heard, the availability of renewable energy is also a key criterion for many firms seeking to locate to Ireland, and that's something which I think needs to be highlighted a little bit more in terms of assisting people in accepting the move towards renewables. However, I do appreciate that you might challenge me and indeed the political system by saying that many of these statements and findings are not surprising and could have been made maybe 2, 5 and even 10 years ago. So I suppose that poses the question, what's different now? Well, I firmly believe that we're no longer in a context of shoulds or coulds or maybes when it comes to renewables development. The IPCC have warned of devastating and even irreversible consequences of warming beyond 1.5 degrees and failing to uphold the Paris Agreement commitments. So the window to act on climate change is closing rapidly. In essence, the government needs to deliver concrete, measurable actions to cut our emissions now and not in 10 years. And we know that the more that you do over a protracted period of time creates less burden at the end. I think the government and official Ireland is starting to come to terms with that concept. Basic concept, you might say, but far too long it has taken to accept that. I've no doubt that the fundamental area of concern at your conference today is, or certainly will be, Ireland's performance on EU climate and renewable energy targets. Research by national and international authorities is consistently highlighting Ireland as the worst performing country in Europe for action on climate change, and indeed the government is not achieving any meaningful decreases in our polluting emissions. It is shocking to see Ireland's reputation tarnished at both EU and UN level. With the title, sadly, that is being provided to us now as climate laggards, and that's to use the Taoiseach's own terminology. Yes, I'm conscious that significant progress has been made towards Ireland's renewables in the electricity target, thanks to the huge efforts in the wind energy sector. You really have been a beacon of light, and your efforts are often perhaps go unnoticed, but I think at a conference like today it's worth recognising the really significant efforts that you have made. Unfortunately, inaction by the government means that we are nowhere near the EU 2020 climate and renewables target, with the latter likely to be missed by a truly staggering 95%. It's very disappointing that this is, as I said, the 2020 failure is simply taken for granted by government and glossed over in its latest narrative on action towards 2030. However, I find it much more disturbing that this government has knowingly neglected Ireland's climate responsibility, having failed to introduce any sort of coordinated climate and renewable strategy in the past 8 years. The Climate Change Advisory Council has now emphasised that the state is completely off track to meeting its national and EU commitments. And just last month, the European Commission highlighted that the government's current and planned actions are completely insufficient for Ireland to meet not only its 2020 targets, but also those for 2030 agreed just last year. And it is the Irish public who will suffer most for this failure, both from the significant environmental and health impacts from failing to decarbonise, but also severe and much more immediate economic repercussions through non-compliance at EU level. The SEAI have indicated that they may run into the hundreds of millions in relation to our 2020 renewable commitments, with the Department of Finance at a recent hearing estimate that the inaction suggests Ireland could be subject to up to 6 billion in fines between 2021 and 2030. That's truly staggering, and I think something which doesn't get talked about enough in public or in the media. I think if it did, it would force government a little bit more to address the situation, because that is entirely to be so wasteful of taxpayers' money. To be clear, I consider any expanding robust and sustainable wind energy sector in conjunction with improved energy infrastructure as one of the main means of resolving this dire state of affairs. I fully believe that investment in renewables is an infinitely more sensible strategically and a more just approach than allowing even higher EU fines. As you are well aware, the debate of unlocking the potential of wind energy is not taking place in a vacuum. Citizens and communities are scared of the worsening impacts of climate change, scared by the fact that those who have done the least to cause climate change are suffering the worst effects, and scared by the lack of information on what climate action means for them and indeed their finances. Yet scared as people may be about climate change and climate action, I also see that all of this is happening at a time there is a stronger appetite than ever for the public to move our energy system from fossil fuels to renewable energy. Just last week, we learned from the EPA research through Red Sea polling that climate change is seen as the most pressing environmental issue in Ireland. The Red Sea surveys have also indicated strong public support for climate action, while Eurobarometer analysis indicated that the Irish public is strongly in favour of financial support for renewable energies. All of this provides a significant basis for a significant shift in policy by our government. This backing was reflected in most concrete terms in 2017 by the Citizens' Assembly, who were very clear that the state should take a leadership role in tackling climate change, and in their recommendations they placed strong emphasis on facilitating people and communities to take part in that energy transition, including the recommendation to pay for microgeneration and ensuring greater levels of community ownership in renewable projects. In short, delegates, public acceptance is there. However, we cannot drive renewable developments to 2030 without addressing community involvement. I appreciate that this is hardly news to people like yourself who have been involved at the coalface, many of whom are at the front line of community engagement, including, forthright opposition to what you're doing in some areas. I am also of the view that a revised regulatory framework for sustainable onshore wind energy development must be urgently produced. Further delays cannot be accepted, and government simply must produce revised planning guidelines that better assess in the first instance and address objections raised by those communities that believe they are impacted. I also note that you have been proactive in this area with the Association's 2030 strategy, setting out a new set of principles and ways of working with communities, and I think that's to be welcomed, and I think it will prove very successful. If we are to move from a disjointed planning to actual delivery, it is now more important than ever that climate action through wind energy is not framed in purely negative terms or abstract targets. Instead, it can allow for local jobs, local investment opportunities, and indeed generate revenue locally. The more people associated with wind energy with opportunities, the smoother it will become to build our renewable energy capacity. As it stands, much remains to be done in terms of facilitating community energy. As a party, Fianna Fáil are firmly of the belief that communities should be at the heart of renewable energy development, whether that is through entirely community-driven schemes, microgeneration or community benefit schemes in larger scale developments. While previous policies have referred to the importance of community in the energy transition, the government has failed to deliver concrete measures that would actually allow this to happen. I'm aware that the government's renewable electricity support scheme will be key not only for community projects but to expanding renewable projects right across the sector. However, I have a real concern about the degree to which RES will deliver on enabling framework for community participation and the knock-on impact this may have on broader action across the wind energy sector. So you might ask what changes are necessary. Well, firstly, we need to spread awareness of the benefits of community energy for local communities. While, though, of a wind farm in the locality tends to provoke a lot of different reactions, positive in some cases and negative in others, few people think the possibility for long-term employment, for investment opportunities, or for warmer homes. And it's often characterised by one or two people in the early stages holding public meetings and attempting to drum up all the negatives. Fortunately, we don't often see enough of community leaders and politicians out there highlighting the positive impacts that wind energy and renewables can bring to this community. So supported, in my view, by the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland, a network of sustainable energy communities have already been established in almost every county. They want to decarbonise and they want to create local jobs and build local resilience, and I think we need to work with these groups. Secondly, it is also essential that wind projects are not merely limited to support for certain community projects or houses in the immediate vicinity. The wider community needs to understand and see the long-term benefits, be that through assistance with home retrofitting, free or discounted electricity for homes in the wider community, or support for other schemes such as solar panel installation. And I strongly encourage the ongoing work that you're doing on expanding community benefit schemes that take into consideration the wider needs of the community rather than, as I have said in the past, just those specific projects that benefit some, don't benefit others, and sadly build up a them and us situation in communities. I think many of you have been engaging more fully, and that's to be welcomed. In a world where many citizens feel increasingly disconnected from their neighbours and lectured to by their politicians, it has never been more important to support community participation in wider national goals. And I believe that community energy projects are also an important way to do so, insofar as they allow communities to decide how and where their energy will be produced and give them an active role in making this happen. Currently, few people realise that starting a renewable energy project might help them to reduce their energy bills or even earn a little extra revenue. They do not realise that it could be the start of a sustainable energy project that teaches their kids about renewable energy, or that it offers a strong social and community outlet. Naturally, there is an economic thread to this self-determination too, and community energy projects help to stimulate the local economy and generate important revenues for local people. The benefits of people and communities in the energy transition are also now recognised in the latest EU Renewable Energy Directive, which sets out enforceable rights to ensure citizens are protected in investing in renewables. In this context, I particularly welcome IWEA's intention to bring forward plans to allow communities to own a share of projects. Facilitating greater community ownership is central in achieving public acceptance of renewable energy projects and towards climate policy more generally. And a change in development model to encompass community ownership helps foster a positive effect on public attitudes. Although there has been a significant increase in recent years in renewable generation, local communities in Ireland own less than 0.3 of 1%. I'm also conscious that a mix of renewable energy sources will be needed to supported by the RES, and I consider it to be particularly important that the state's offshore wind resource potential receives support under the new scheme. Fianna Fáil fully supports offshore wind development. Unfortunately, the government has lagged behind in terms of introducing the type of supports and subsidies that offshore wind projects will need to get off the ground, with the result that we have yet to capitalise on our natural advantage, which is obvious to most in terms of the wind that can be harvested off our west coast, and that is challenging, and also within the IRC. We recognise the need for a legislative framework for regulatory and licensing aspects of offshore wind as a matter of priority. The Maritime Area and Foreshore Amendment Bill is particularly significant in this regard, and we are calling on the Government to prioritise its passage through the Oireachtas immediately, not next year or the year after that. Furthermore, we need to ensure that Ireland has a physical infrastructure and skill set base needed to support multiple forms of renewable energy technology. Before I finish, delegates, I want to address the broader need for a fundamental step change across all government if Ireland is to deliver on our renewable energy commitments and provide necessary supports and investment. You may already be aware that Fianna Fáil and other opposition parties responded to the Climate Assembly's recommendation on climate change and ensured the establishment of a new Oireachtas committee to examine the necessary policy changes. Having met with experts across the sector over the past 3 months at the end of 2018, an all-party report will be published soon. And I'm pleased that there are a very strong consensus across the parties for urgent action in renewables energy in order to respond to the more ambitious 2050 targets. In particular, we have taken into account recent analysis commissioned by yourselves and others that it is technically possible and cost neutral for Ireland to significantly ramp up renewables to the level of 70% of electricity generation. We have therefore included a recommendation that Government introduce amending legislation in 2019 to set a target to supply this level of renewable by 2030. Now that is a little bit of news for you perhaps. It still has to be agreed by the committee, but I'm strongly of the view that it will be adapted. The committee recommendations will also demand radically improved climate targets, governance and accountability by government, including with regard to the wind energy development guidelines, development of offshore wind capacity off our coast for 2030, as well as community-owned renewable energy. To conclude, the need for a transformed and fully decarbonised energy system is not in doubt. Fianna Fáil considers that this must be rooted in an inclusive, community-based approach to onshore wind and a coherent, ambitious approach to offshore wind energy. Government needs to leave behind the principle of wait and see. Climate action through renewables simply cannot be treated as tomorrow's challenge. We need to facilitate, not hinder, early action by your industry. I strongly support the efforts of IWEA to include citizens and encourage greater efforts, whether it be through opening up of ownership opportunities to local residents or providing assistance to communities and households through the various initiatives that have been talked about. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.